science, philosophy, the law, three different things, but we all need to pull together in our own ways to support animals. The styles of argument are very different across the three cases. I think in the law sometimes precedent has this huge importance. And so it can be hard in situations where evidence is very new and changing rapidly to explain to lawmakers and policymakers that the situation has changed, that the evidence is not what it was. In science, by contrast, this idea of the evidence changing rapidly is something people are very familiar with, very comfortable with. The idea that what seems like knowledge today might not be knowledge tomorrow. It's a normal part of science, but I think sometimes it leads to a certain reluctance to say things about how human actions are affecting animals. It leads scientists to be too neutral a lot of the time because they don't want to be caught out saying something that in their view goes beyond the evidence, and they don't want to be seen expressing their values. And I sometimes think those strictures are a little bit too tight, and scientists do actually need to be willing to express their values and to say when they think the evidence supports changing what we do. And I see a really valuable role for philosophy in bridging that gap. It's what I'm trying to do with my Foundations of Animal Sentience team. Again, philosophical argument is a bit different. Again, it's not a legal argument, it's not a scientific argument, but it's about trying to marshal all the scientific evidence for arguing for why we ought to do things differently, for why we need to change the way we relate to animals. And I hope that bridging role can be really powerful, because philosophers like me, we go to the science, we synthesize the evidence, and we say, here is why this matters, here is what it all means for how we live and what we do.
So at the most basic level, science and the law offers methods for arriving at conclusions that those within the field recognize as scientific or legal facts. And legal decision makers, they have to have some way to access facts about the world in order to make their legal determinations. So courts will resolve disputes and give orders based on evidence presented to it. Lawmakers will make rules based on facts that it has gathered from a variety of sources. And the way science enters into the legal context is as scientific reports or expert evidence. So science is just one source of facts that legal decision makers rely on to make their determinations. In the animal advocacy context, animal cognition research has been relied upon to make two types of arguments. The first kind of argument is about animal legal status. And the second is about the kind of harmful impacts that certain human activities can have on animals. So, for example, animal cognition research was relied on unsuccessfly in arguing for animal legal personhood in the Non-Human Rights Project cases. Another example is animal cognition research on cetaceans was relied on successfully in the passage of Canadian legislation banning cetacean captivity. Animal cognition research can really help us get better outcomes for animals, but they don't settle legal outcomes because obviously a lot of other considerations come into play.
Science and the law are both about finding truth, and I think that science has provided the foundation for the case for animal rights. Both, whether it's legally, morally, or ethically, science has shown us that animals are like us in all the ways that matter, and we need to reform the law to reflect that, and that hasn't been done yet.
Scientists and lawyers initially, in some ways, have a lot in common in the sense that, they're sort of people who take on professions, and there's this old joke, which is basically the people who do well on organic chemistry become scientists or doctors, and the people who don't become lawyers. So, there's kind of a lot of social background that's somewhat similar, but the professions are very different. And science is, first of all, about gaining knowledge. It's revisable, it's probabilistic, it's process oriented in that way. Whereas law is really about action. It's about doing things. It's about making decisions. It's about getting things done. And the rules of evidence in law, for example, are extremely formal, whereas in science it is somewhat more open-ended in terms of what counts as evidence for a hypothesis. So there's a kind of openness to science, the way that I think about it, and a kind of necessary closeness to law that make them quite different, and also often means that scientists and lawyers will have sort of different attitudes towards things. Lawyers will be much more interested in getting to a conclusion than scientists will have. I think that brings out some of the similarities and differences between science and the law, and between the people who are scientists, kind of temperamentally, and people who become lawyers.
The last 3 decades have been an incredible influx of really cool, revolutionary information about animal minds and hearts and souls and intelligence and emotion. And my sense, even though this science has been blossoming, is that the state of animals in the world is much worse than it was 30 years ago. I was kind of hoping that these things would flower together, and that hasn't happened. And I think there are a multitude of reasons why. One thing that I have seen happening that I find very distressing is the co-optation of science by animal industry, by those who want to exploit animals. And they even have sort of created this entire scientific field called animal welfare science, which sounds wonderful. It's like we're going to make the lives of animals better by better understanding all the things that we do to torture them and how those things cause pain and suffering, and then things will get better for them. And in fact, that has not been the case. To give the other side of that, the positive side of it, I mean, for sure, science has changed the way I think and relate to and care for animals. Knowing about the science of canine cognition has really helped me give my dog a better life, because I know, for example, that she just needs time to sniff with no agenda other than her own, and that a walk for her doesn't mean being on the end of a leash, staying on my heel, and the sort of what you might think of as a good dog, walking in a straight line on a leash at the same pace as their person, is a dog who's not getting a great sensory experience. My experience of awe in nature and in the company of animals is definitely enhanced by understanding more scientifically about who they are or what their experience of the world is like.
I'm really interested in attribution science and the way that attribution can bring into focus new agents of responsibility. And so I think of the science as opening up questions of who is responsible in the landscape of the law. And we've had a lot of ideas of, the government being responsible for oversight, consumers being responsible for certain choices, producers, but we're seeing how science and research can open up questions of who is responsible for both animal harms and protection. And I would just add that, it's hard to imagine the law out in front of science and research. It feels like science, research, and ethics are always sort of, or should be, out in front of the law. And so that's where I choose to put my efforts. I often feel like our institutions are much further behind in some ways than a lot of the good empirical work that I read.
When I think about the relationship between science and law, as a scientist, I think mostly about how typical training in science is that you don't think about it being applied, like that you just get trained in basic science. You're just supposed to be generating knowledge that doesn't necessarily have any impact on the world. So I think most scientists actually are not thinking about the law at all. And then, what you saw happen in a major way with like climate modelers and climate scientists is realizing they actually really did have to start thinking about law and policy and engage with real world questions that have, global impact. So you started seeing a shift there. And then I think that, in animal science, we're not quite there yet in terms of thinking about how we interface with law and policy, but it's beginning. And obviously there's more applied scientists that are completely looking at like how their work can be shaped, but shape the law, but it's usually, I think, from an industry perspective. So I think there's still like a little bit discomfort for scientists who are studying animals and animal behavior to understand how their work could interface with law and policy. And then I think even beyond that, and where I would like to see happen, is not just how science is sort of influencing the law and influencing policy, but for scientists to also begin to reflect on how the law and policy shapes science, and then therefore what kinds of laws and policy we would want to engage with and sort of be shaped by, rather than sort of passively be shaped by the status quo laws and policies.
Science and law are both places where the evidence really counts, but what types of evidence count that are brought to bear can differ drastically. So I think it's really important for scientists and lawyers and legal advocates to have a lot of collaboration from our different disciplines. The legal systems, especially the American legal system, is a real adversarial system. It's kind of two sides having it out in a court being presided over by a judge. Science, there are so many more parties. I'm a scientist, and we work by peer review. So not only subjected to the scrutiny of your peers, but literally everything else that comes after you. Papers can be retracted, or new papers can come out that invalidates old findings. So it's really about kind of providing staying power that is constantly being exposed to new waves of the truth. And I suppose the legal system can be similar in a way. The harder you think about the differences between law and science, the more those differences kind of start to break down a little bit.
Science is about finding out information about the natural world. So it's descriptive and generates is statements. And law is about figuring out what we ought to do. Right? So it's generating these normative statements about shoulds and how we should engage in action. But we don't know how to engage in action without knowing something about the world. So if the law says just follow the law, or just do good and do the good thing, you're like, well, what's the good thing? I don't know. And science can help inform what the good thing would be based on what, right, the good or the right is in the legal system. So really, I think that you need both science and the law working together in order to justify rational action.
In a perfect world, science and the law might sort of operate like these alternating pistons, with each one kind of propelling the other one forward and neither getting too far ahead. But in reality, that's not always how it works. These are very different fields. They don't always mash onto each other very well. And they're different in a lot of important ways. So science, I think just the speed at which it moves is so rapid, and that's so different from the law, right? When there's new scientific findings, they can be announced sort of with this immediacy through journals and headlines, and there's new scientific findings happening all the time. And the law is not like that, right? The law is bound by precedent, what's happened before. It's bound by judicial restraint. What are the issues that are actually in front of the court to consider? And it takes so long from the time you start a court case to when you're actually able to see kind of the law change in that way. And so I think that the law is much slower to react and uptake those scientific findings. So I think that's one important way in which they're different. I think also, science is much more universal than the law. We like to think that there's this sort of objective scientific truth that's, the same sort of here as it is in Australia or in Indonesia. And the law, of course, is incredibly different, even from one state to the next, from one city or local jurisdiction to the next. So in that way, I think science can kind of be an equalizing force in global animal law, in so much as these laws are tethered to a scientific standard that is more consistent across country lines and state lines and party lines, hopefully. So I think that's another way in which they're different. But they're also similar in that, these are both shaped by human factors in many different ways. Humans are the ones interpreting law, and humans are the ones interpreting science. And there's so much about both of those two disciplines that's shaped by who is reading the facts, how they're reading them, and what sort of preconceived notions they're bringing to that decision making. So I think, lots of similarities and differences.